Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, either in person or on Zoom. I am Alexa Smith, and I am the Educational Exchange and Event Program Manager with the Office of International Programs. And this is Foundations of Global Health in conjunction with the International Orthopedic Trauma Collaborative. Just a little bit about our series. Global health is an area for study, research, and practice that places a priority on improving health and achieving equity in health for all people worldwide. Global health emphasizes transnational health issues, determinants, and solutions, involves many disciplines within and beyond the health sciences, and promotes interdisciplinary collaboration, and is a synthesis of a population-based prevention with individual-level clinical care. And that is from the Consortium of Universities for Global Health. Global health is a varied and rich discipline to which many healthcare providers, researchers, and faculty aspire to being professionally engaged. With our being a globally connected world, this ongoing programming through the Office of International Programs is designed to feature those in our KUMC community engaged in the field of global health, KUMC's faculty, researchers, and clinicians, our international partners, and our community partners. Presenters will share their personal journeys, educational backgrounds, mentors, books and articles that gave inspiration, challenges, lessons learned, successes, epiphanies, life-changing moments, and even the heartbreaks. The series is meant to provide a platform for both presenters and participants to participate in conversations while developing foundational knowledge and exploring best practices for engagement in the discipline of global health. We will be back on February 25th, so keep your eyes out for that email from me. And the reason all of this got started, Dr. Archie Heddings. Dr. Heddings is a practicing orthopedic surgeon in the University of Kansas Health System. He's also director of an international orthopedic trauma fellowship that focuses on alleviating disparities in trauma care throughout Africa. Now, the etiology of conflict-related trauma and self-harm.
Thanks, everybody, for coming today. And I think if you saw the invite email, we're going to be discussing a rather sensitive topic. But it's one that needs to be addressed because if we're going to overcome or have an impact on this trauma epidemic, we have to address the issues that are causing it. And one of the major causes of death as a result of this trauma epidemic is conflict-related violence and self-harm, and these two are tightly related. When you look at the continent of Africa, and you look at how much life has been lost due to conflict over the years, it's difficult to know exactly what those numbers are. I think many of us are familiar with the approximately 450,000 deaths that occurred with the Rwandan genocide. When the Tutsis were massacred. More recently, estimates as high as 600,000 Ethiopians have died due to violence within its borders. And even more difficult to get an actual number of is the amount of deaths that have occurred in the Congo region, with estimates as high as 5.4 million deaths related to conflict-related violence in the area of the Congo, making that the highest loss of life since World War II due to a conflict. And how many people here have heard of that? Like, it's not something that we know a lot about. But I think if we're going to treat this, we have to understand what's causing it and how we can intervene and make an impact. And that's the purpose of this talk today. The purpose of this talk today is not to point fingers at various parties or political institutions. The purpose of this talk today is to make the point that conflict does exist in Africa, the continent of Africa, and understand why it occurs. And not that it's something as simplistic as ethnic tensions or poor political regimes. I think it's much more complicated than that. And when we get an understanding of that, then we can then come up with plans in terms of how to impact it. So first to start, we just want to talk about some basic definitions. So this paper here it's called Conflict Trends in Africa, and it comes out from, it's produced by the Peace Research Institute of Oslo. And it just looks at battle-related trends in Africa from 1989 to 2021. And they have some basic definitions. So you have state-based conflicts, and these are contested incompatibility over government and or territory with at least one party being a state, and involving the use of armed force that results in at least 25 battle-related deaths within a calendar year. And you have non-state conflicts. This is armed force between organized groups, none of which is the government or a state, that results in at least 25 annual battle-related deaths. Then you have one-sided violence, the use of armed force by the government or a state or a formally organized group against civilians, that results in at least 25 battle-related deaths. And then all battle-related deaths or fatalities, including civilian losses caused by warring parties, and that can be directly related to combat. When you talk about Africa, the majority of conflict that you see are conflicts within states. They're within states. They're not between states typically, but these are conflicts that occur within states. So civil type conflicts are very common in Africa compared to conflicts between states. I think that's an important thing to point out. When you look at Africa in general, I have just these maps that show state-based conflicts, and then next to that you'll see non-state conflicts, and then after that you'll see one-sided conflicts. And what you'll notice is that these are all occurring predominantly in the same areas, right? Where you have got state-based conflicts, you've also got non-state conflicts, and you've also got one-sided conflicts. So it's just an interesting point in terms of an area where you have conflicts. They seem to be, prevalent there, all types. And then in the areas that are stable, for the most part, those tend to be the stable portions of Africa. And you can see the more stable portions are the more northern portions and the more southern portions. The total number of state-based conflicts was 30 in 2020. And of those, 11 were civil wars. The remaining 19 were internationalized civil wars. So when it comes to internationalized civil wars, that's basically saying some outside actor is coming in and they're providing arms, or they're maybe fomenting a conflict. And if you look at the results of internationalized conflicts, sometimes it can be good. Sometimes other states, like America or Europe or China, can come in and help bring peace. But on the other hand, sometimes it can actually foment the war more, provide more weapons, and then increase the lethality of the war. So in terms of internationalized conflicts, state actors from outside Africa can have a positive impact, but their influence needs to be used wisely. When you look at non-state conflicts broken down between formally organized groups, informally organized groups, and informally organized identity groups, Africa is currently the region most severely affected by non-state conflicts. And I just have a list there of those. So those can be terrorist organizations, or those can be like a group within the country that represents a specific ethnicity or a specific religion, and they declare themselves a group, and then they start taking action due to some incompatibility that they have with maybe people around them. One-sided violence. Africa is the region with the largest absolute number of fatalities from one-sided violence. This type of violence is perpetuated mainly by non-state actors. A lot of these can be terrorist organizations like ISIS, but other ones can be state actors. So the state can act against its own people. And when African governments get involved in this type of violence, this is where typically you see the most fatalities. An example of this is the 540,000 deaths in 1994 that occurred when the Rwandan government got involved with the genocide. So those can be very lethal. So when people, and particularly when you're something like a genocide of, that occurred in Rwanda, you almost have this knee-jerk response of, well, it's tribal violence or ethnic violence. these ethnicities can't get along because they can't get along. It results in this conflict and deaths. And that's just why Africa is riddled with so much conflict-related violence. But again, the point of this talk is to show that I think that is a very myopic view of what is causing a lot of this conflict-related violence in Africa. But it does need to be mentioned. It needs to be mentioned. So if you look, here's just a map, and this was taken from the Encyclopedia Britannica. If you look at this map, this shows the different ethno-linguistic groups within Africa, and then it's broken down by color into these large language families. But there is a lot of diversity in Africa. There are, if you look at this, how many, according to Ethnologue's geographical distribution of living languages, there are 2,058 languages spoken in Africa, about 30% of the world's total 6,809 living languages. So Africa, even though it's 13% of the world's population, 1 out of every 3 languages used in the world is in an African language. So it's true. There's a lot of diversity in Africa, right? And if you look at, say, the rest of the world, they average about 3.2 to 4.7 ethnic groups per country. Africa, on average, they've got about 8 in each country. And then to further complicate that, you have all of these different ethnicities in Africa. They speak different languages, but then Africa was colonized. So when Africa became colonized, you had countries from Europe coming in, and they started laying down borders. But when they laid down these borders, when France and Great Britain and other European countries started laying down borders, they didn't lay them down with respect to ethnicity. They divided their countries up in such a way that you would put within the same country some rival ethnic groups. So it did complicate the matter in terms of colonialization, and a lot of these borders still persist today. So you have borders that cut across ethnic groups, and you'll have rival ethnic groups within the same country. And you can imagine that makes things difficult. So starting out ethnically, it does look like Africa has a challenge. But what you'll see as we go through this is ethnic diversity can actually be a safeguard against conflict. So there's other things involved when it comes to conflict. And one of the things that seems to be involved most in determining conflict is the economy. If there's one thing that I've learned in preparing this talk, and I think people have learned in life, hungry people are angry people, okay? We've all gotten hangry before, but imagine if that's your life. Imagine if you can't feed your children, right? That's different. Now you're really angry. And then imagine if you see someone else who may live near you or someplace close to you or within the same country, and they're doing just fine. That creates tension. What are the economics of African nations? And what are the economics of African nations that influence conflict? Well, as we discussed in some of our previous talks, many of the poor nations in the world, many of the low-income nations in the world, in fact, Africa is home to most of the lower-income nations of the world. And what contributes to that? A lot of it is the fact that they have what's called extroverted economies. What's an extroverted economy? An extroverted economy is an economy that depends on exports. So what we have here, I have on the right of your screen or on the left of your screen is export dependence within African nations. And what you'll see is in Ethiopia there, you'll see it's export dependent on agricultural products. You have some countries in blue energy, that'd be oil, natural gas. And then if you look in the center there, DR Congo, Zambia, they are dependent on ores, metals, precious stones. So, and then you've got few non-commodity dependent countries. And then if you look at this, the other on the right, total export dependence, red means they're more export dependent. And look at how much of Africa is export dependent. Why does that matter? Well, here's a graph that shows the price of tantalum. So if you're export dependent, the value of your currency is largely dependent on that export and how it's doing. So if you look at tantalum, for example, which is a mineral or a product that's used in our cell phones, much of it's derived from the Congo. Look at how that price fluctuates, right? What do you think that's going to do to your currency? It's going to fluctuate. Well, it's going to fluctuate with that a lot. What about copper? The Congo produces a lot of copper. And look at the fluctuations here. So if you're an extroverted economy that depends upon your exports, how your economy does is tied to these fluctuations. You can have good times, but you can have times that are very bad. Particularly if you're somebody that's working on the lower end and every day you only make enough just to feed your family. And if you don't show up to work that day, you don't have enough to feed your family. You can't take a sick day literally, because if you do take a sick day, you can't pay to feed yourself and your family. So, and then if the price of that commodity drops and there's no reason for them to be mining it currently, you're laid off. Now you're really in a situation. So that is something that lends itself to conflict. So we're going to go through this, and we're going to go through a little discussion here. If you want to protect yourself from that type of fluctuation in your economy, you need what's called diversification. Not only do you need to depend on what you're exporting in terms of raw minerals, but ideally you need to have people that have other skills. In other words, they can come up with ideas to create things. You can have manufacturing that manufactures different types of goods. You can take the product out of the ground, and rather than selling it in its raw form, like say an emerald, a raw emerald, you can actually cut it so it can be used in jewelry. You can have your own economy where you trade amongst yourselves, so your economy can support itself. It's called economic diversification. And economic diversification protects you from these types of fluctuations. So I'm just going to go through a process here in terms of just like describing how a poor nation can fall into conflict. So we're going to start out with a poor nation that's commodity dependent, and it's low on the global value chain. And what does that mean? Global value chains are what have developed in this global economy where you provide a contribution to making a particular good. Okay? If you're low on the global value chain, what that means is you just produce the raw element. You take something out of the ground, it's basically a crushed up rock, and then you give it to somebody else. How much do you think you make off that? Very little. You make very little. Now, so if you then take, say, maybe that emerald that doesn't look that nice and just came out of the ground, and you shine it and you polish it, now you can sell that for a little bit more. If you insert it into jewelry, you can sell that for something. And if you own the company that sells the jewelry, now you're basically taking all the profit from that. Does that make sense? When you're in the global value chain at the very bottom, you make the least out of it. What Asia has done is they've moved up the global value chain. Asia has moved, if you think about China, they've moved up the global value chain to where they're producing so much of what we use. And they're even now getting into the highest part of the global value chain where they're innovators. Not only are they producing it, but they're looking at it and they're saying, how can this iPhone be better? How can this satellite be better? And now you're at the top of the global value chain. So where Asia has climbed up the global value chain and they've raised the standard of living for their people, this has not happened in Africa. So we'll start out with a poor nation. It's commodity dependent, it's low on the global value chain. Let's say they produce uranium. Lacking the finances to develop the mines, to harvest and pay for the roadways, to transport the raw material out of the country, it takes a loan, and it's a resource-backed loan. So in other words, a rich nation comes to them and says, we want you to get us uranium. We'd like to buy it from you. They say, we would love to get it for you, but we don't have the ability to make this mine or the roadways to get it out. The rich nation replies, happy to help you with that. We'll make the roads for you. We'll make the mine for you. You have to pay us back. But here's the deal. If you don't pay us back, we get your mine. It's a bad deal, right? But this is what's occurring in a lot of nations. But this country goes for that. So they signed the deal. The loans taken from a nation that has substantial rival nations that are also investing in Africa. So other people are eyeing this. Some other rich nation that's a world power militarily looks at it and says, boy, we would sure like that uranium. Darn it, wish we could have signed that deal. Low-wage jobs are created for many people harvesting the raw ore and making roads. And while a few are made very wealthy that are in privileged positions in the government or from a land/company ownership standpoint, others are just making a measly amount from simply digging holes in the ground and gathering this raw ore. This is how it works a lot of the time. Those in the privileged positions are of one ethnic group, while those performing the low-wage jobs are of another. The government is politically aligned with the wealthy ethnic group, while the poor ethnic groups have no voice in government and little economic upward mobility. Now, due to decreased global demand for the price of uranium, all of a sudden the world becomes a very peaceful place. We decide we don't need to spend our money on making nuclear bombs right now. Nobody wants to buy it. An economic crisis ensues, with the country being unable to service its debt, and the poverty worsens within that country. The country loses a number of its uranium mines to its creditor because they say, okay, you can't pay up. We're going to take that mine. That further worsens its losses of revenue caused by the decreased price of uranium. Now, who do you think's affected the most? The people at the very bottom. And dissatisfaction amongst impoverished ethnic groups with no voice in government and no educational or upward or economic mobility start a conflict financed by a rival nation who wants access to that country's uranium. What money the government does have, now instead of being spent on education or healthcare or strengthening the government, is spent on a war effort, decreasing any money that was spent on education or strengthening government systems that need to be there to place, basic citizens' needs. The economy worsens, decreasing prospects of diversifying the economy. You can't diversify an economy in that situation. And moving up the global value chain, who wants to invest in a country in terms of an outside nation? Who wants to invest in a business in a country that's in conflict? The answer is virtually none. That further entrenches the poverty and increases its susceptibility to other conflicts. The country's propensity for violence scares off future investors, further worsening its prospects for economic growth. So that takes you through basically kind of a stepwise progression of what happens over and over again in many African nations. How are we doing on time? 26. Okay. All right. I'm going to move quickly through this next spot. There are predictive models now, a lot of them artificial intelligence, machine-based learning, that can predict civil war if it's going to occur or not occur. It's very interesting. And a lot of these go back to, this is a paper, I believe, from in the 80s or 90s, where they came up with a mathematical model to predict civil war. Okay. And the whole point of these slides is just to make the point that this is not just about ethnic or linguistic differences. Okay. My feeling is, when I go through this, if we were in the same situation that Africa were in, America would essentially be like Africa. There is just a complexity of issues that are contributing to this problem of conflict that we are seeing there. Humans are no different here than they are in Africa. We're all exactly the same. These models work all over the world. We are currently in a very privileged position that does not make us susceptible to conflict. So if you look at, this is an early model, it simplifies it. If you look at the AI models, they're very complex, but they can supposedly predict within like 93% accuracy or 97% accuracy if a civil war is going to occur. What did they find out in some of these models? So what this shows is the probability of civil war at low and high levels of political rights and variable ethno-linguistic fractionalization. And this is a parabola here. And you can see this shows the bottom 10% of polity, and polity means that this is a government that is strong and gives voices to all of its people. So if there is a particular group within that society, by religion or ethnicity or anything else, that has a grievance, they can bring it to the nation, they can bring it to the government, and they'll feel like they're heard, and some response is made. And what you see here is that when people don't have a voice, once you get to a little bit over about 50% of ethno-linguistic fractionalization, the chance of war is very high. In other words, they said in this model, if you have about 60% of the nation of one group and 40% of another group, and that 40% doesn't feel heard, the chance of civil war is incredibly high. On the other hand, if you just give a voice to people where they can voice their grievances and say, I don't feel like I'm being heard, look how it drops the probability of civil war. It demonstrates you need a strong government that lets different groups be heard if you're going to have something that protects against civil war. This shows the probability of civil war if you look at ethno-linguistic fractionalization, so differences that way versus the gross domestic product. And you can see the bottom of the gross domestic product is here, and then you can see the top of the gross domestic product is here. And you can see in this model, what was more important was people being heard politically, but economics does play a role here, right? If people are poor, it gets to that point. If you're hungry, if you're a hungry person or a hungry group, you're an angry person, an angry group. This shows if you have an economy that is extroverted or highly commodity dependent. So if you're very, very commodity dependent versus lowly commodity dependent, the lower you are in terms of being dependent on commodities, the lower your risk of a civil war. And this one shows they just put democracy and income together. So in other words, if you look at this, your risk of civil war is really high if you're poor and you aren't being heard. If everybody's doing well economically and everybody's being heard, what's your chance for civil war? Like, right? That's a happy society, right? There's a recipe for achieving this. And this just puts them all together. It puts ethno-linguistic fractionalization, commodity dependence, and gross domestic product together. And the more diverse your economy is, the more well-off your citizens are, and the more they're heard, the less chance for civil war. So the point of all this is that it's not just about ethnic and linguistic differences. It is about the economy. It is about the ability for a group of people to elevate themselves within the world economy. And it shows that we, as a world, if we're concerned about everybody in this world, that we have a part in helping some of these other nations to elevate themselves out of this trap, as I took you through that kind of whole circular process of poverty and conflict, to help elevate some of these nations out of this trap that they're in. Particularly, this feeds into my next slide, particularly if we are benefiting from those countries, which we are. So conflict minerals, these are called the 3 TGs, and that stands for tantalum, tin, tungsten. Those are the 3 Ts, and gold. What are conflict minerals? Well, conflict minerals primarily come from the Democratic Republic of Congo, the eastern part. Many of them are used to make our circuit boards, our cell phones, and there's a lot of conflict related to this. Many deaths have occurred in this region. Like I said, estimates as high as 5.4 million. And what you have is you have rivaling factions that will want to harvest this raw ore and then put it on the world stage to enter into these global value chains that are then used to make cell phones and these things that we want for military technology. And this just shows how you can move this product out of the DRC or out of Rwanda. It goes to Asia, In Asia, they take the raw ore and then they make it into something that can be used in circuit boards. And then, it will go to these places in China and Hong Kong where they'll make these circuit boards and then it gets shipped back to us. Okay, we benefit from these cheap minerals that are coming out of Africa. I think everybody here has a cell phone. And I think everybody here has some, if you've got a cell phone, you've got tantalum, you've got tin, you've got gold, and you've got tungsten. You can't have a cell phone without those things. Down here is a link to it's just a video on conflict minerals. Sorry, I want to come out of that. I'll only play that if we have time. So I just need to know how to move past it. Why? Next. Here we go. Okay. All right. So the Dodd-Frank Act was passed to try and stop the flow of conflict minerals occurring from nefarious means. It has not been that successful. Okay. It's because what happens is you have people obtaining these conflict minerals from nefarious means, and they're still getting dumped onto the world stage, and we're still using them. So, and when I showed this to some of my children, I described this to them, they felt like, Dad, what can we do? We don't even know what we can do. I mean, if we're trying to pass laws to prevent these minerals that are obtained, through conflict, being dumped into our cell phones, and we're not even aware of how, we have to have a cell phone, Dad. You can't function in society without that. So it's not like we're going to have a boycott on cell phones, but what we do propose is this. A very tangible way that we can affect this is this. A conflict that is causing the trauma. There currently is no great way to treat the trauma that's occurring as a result of this conflict. If you want to have a tangible impact on that trauma, let's build up a health system that can treat the people that are suffering as a result of it. These laws are important. I'm not saying they're not. They're not, but they're being circumvented. And while we're trying to work out those things, these circumventions that are occurring, why don't we build up systems that can help the people that are suffering as a result of it? I want to turn this over now to Betty, who's going to give a little brief talk on self-harm.
Well, good day, everybody. I hope you can see me. So we're going to be talking about self-harm for the next few minutes with me. My name is Betty Kasa. I am from Ethiopia, and I am a pediatrician and a pediatric critical care specialist who was working in Ethiopia up until very recently. So this is going to be a talk about what is self-harm. Self-harm is the deliberate injury inflicted upon oneself as a coping mechanism for emotional distress. It can be performed in different ways, and all of them lead to an individual being hurt and having an impacted psychological trauma. Globally speaking, around 17% of individuals worldwide engage in self-harming behavior at least once in their lifetimes. And the prevalence of suicidality or self-harm is significantly higher if somebody lives or is in an area that is war affected as compared to non-war affected regions. When we come to Africa as a continent itself, it's a growing public health concern in the continent, and a larger percentage of suicide and self-harm happens in low and middle income countries, such as the ones found in Africa. And this is because there's a lot of vulnerable population in the continent of Africa, like the disproportionately high rates of self-harm due to people who are displaced internally or who live in war-affected areas, or because most or the majority of the population in the continent is young. Nearly 65% of the population is under the age of 18 years. So you can imagine. When we talk about the prevalence in Africa itself, the median lifetime prevalence of self-harm in the continent has been reported around 10% in adolescents. And there is a huge gender difference where women are more likely to be affected by it than men. And regarding the specific country where I come from Ethiopia, it is usually, it's starting to get, we're starting to see, as you can see here, an upward trend in the number of people who are affected by self-harm and self-harming behaviors. So one of the biggest issues we face in the continent is underreporting. We do not know how many people are affected because there is no reliable or comprehensive data on the subject. And also communities often attribute self-harm to spirituality or mere moral failings, or they generally discourage people from reporting when they have psychiatric problems or when they start have suicidal ideations in general. Some causes that are attributed to self-harm include the socioeconomic challenges that were being discussed by Dr. Headings, such as poverty and unemployment. And when it comes to women, it's really largely dependent on the fact that women are more likely to be affected by domestic violence, sexual, emotional, and physical abuse as well. There is family conflict as another cause, and depression and previous self-harm are also reported to be reasons. When we talk about self-harm or any mental health problems in the continent of Africa, we have to think cultural and societal factors because it's a deeply societally and culturally intertwined continent, and things like social stigma play a huge role for people not to report when they have mental health problems, and they do keep it inside because it's usually regarded as somebody who's, you know, being attacked by some spirits, or they're having moral weakness. That's why they're having the symptoms. So families tend to conceal people who do experience these problems, and they do not take them for medical care. The other is gender norms and inequity. This is a big problem, and there are high rates of gender-based violence in the continent, as well as women have limited autonomies. They are likely to live under societal pressures in the continent. And the most important, I feel like, is the collectivist norm that is within the society. One person does not make a decision for him or herself. Rather, it has to be seen on the context of how does it affect the community in large. So you're more likely not to be cared for, not to be seeking care as well. Conflict and displacement is another huge issue that we're going to be discussing in the next couple of slides, where refugees and internally displaced people are at higher risk for violence and loss of their home and their communities in general, and they do have less support as well, so they're more likely to be affected. So the next slide is going to be me discussing gender-based violence, and it's going to be a few cases that I'm going to be presenting, and I wanted to present them because I wanted to highlight how the severity of the situation, just to give you an idea of it. So these are 3 cases that I have. They're courtesy from my colleagues, two from the DRC and 1 from Ethiopia. The first case is a 70-year-old woman. She was assaulted by rebels, and she was suffering fistula when she presented to the hospital. She hid in a forest for 3 years without any medical care because there was no access to medical care. The second case is a 23-year-old woman. She was assaulted by 15 men. She's from the Democratic Republic of Congo and had chronic incontinence because of the trauma that she endured. And when she came to the hospital, finally, when she was able to seek care, the surgeons were unable to repair the fistulas because they were so extensive. They had to try 6 times. She will remain incontinent for the rest of her life. The third case was a 13-year-old Eritrean girl, which is a country neighboring Ethiopia, and she lived in a refugee camp in the northern part of Ethiopia. When she presented, she was sexually assaulted by individuals who were around 10, and once the assault was over, she was burned. The reason she came to the hospital was because she had extensive burns and she was getting care for that. The common pattern you see here is the women did not come for their emotional trauma that they experienced. The only reason they were able to come to the hospital was because they were physically having symptoms. You can imagine this is the tip of the iceberg, how bad it's going to be for the rest of the people who live in these conditions. When we talk about gender-based violence, it is violence against women and girls. Specifically, it is severe in rural areas and in areas where there is conflict. And reports indicate in the continent of Africa, around 42 to 90% of women, depending on the region, have experienced gender-based violence during their lifetimes. Factors that usually contribute is societal pressures, limited autonomy, and lack of support. The Ethiopian Demographic and Health Survey has reported that among the women within the country of Ethiopia, which is some 120 million people, aged 15 to 49, 23% of women have experienced physical violence and 10% experience sexual violence. And this is what is reported, mind you. And 4% of women who have experienced physical violence during their pregnancy. And the single largest reason for women experiencing violence is living with a man, married or otherwise. So when we talk about gender-based violence and self-harm, we should also see the impact it has. There is social isolation that comes from being abused, and this usually comes in the form of alienation from the community and being blamed for what happened to you. The other is the social impacts. There is increased risk for depression, PTSD, and anxiety. Because of the trauma that you endured, you are also being blamed. So this multiplies the kind of psychological trauma that you're going through, and you're more likely to resort to desperate attempts such as self-harm and suicide. And this also gets magnified when we talk about conflict and displacement. Self-harm comes in different forms, and the most vulnerable people during conflict and displacement are the refugees who are kids, who are women, and who are adolescents. And displacement report the highest rates of depression, anxiety, and self-harm when it was being studied across different parts of Africa. Many of these women, adolescents, and children exhibit signs of PTSD, and women who face sexual violence while their children are, women face sexual violence while children are forced to be recruited into the military in the armies. So you can see that these vulnerable populations are the ones that are being affected by it. A research showed that a refugee camp in the DRC had significant portions of their survivors of sexual violence reported trying to commit suicide or committing suicide. So what are the coping mechanisms for being internally displaced or being harmed in general? There are adaptive response and the maladaptive response. Mostly the adaptive response is when religion and spirituality supports you. There isn't enough support in the community or in the country regarding psychiatric support or medical care. So most people go towards these institutions of religion and spiritual practices because they are the only options that are available. But as we're going to discuss again, those are not exactly the best options always. And most people resort to having maladaptive coping mechanisms such as harming themselves. When you talk about the long-term impacts of conflict in mental health, there is intergenerational trauma that comes with it. People who were raised in violent environments are more likely to have maladaptive coping responses, and they're more likely to go towards violent practices. And kids who are raised in these communities are more likely to not have options as well, as we're going to see on this slide. Research done on the effects of war and displacement in Syria showed that children who were born or raised in the time of war and displacement were more likely when they grow up to have decreased cognitive functioning, decreased emotional regulations, and also decreased affective processing in general. So what are the challenges for us to address this self-harm epidemic that we're seeing within the continent itself and other low and middle income countries? One, there is less access to support. So care providers such as psychiatrists are rarely available. There's poor funding for care for any psychiatric problems that people might have faced, or counseling in general has poor funding. There's limited access to care specifically in displacement camps and rural areas as well. And there's shortage of trained professionals in general. The next thing is, as we said earlier, one of the coping mechanisms people use is religion. Usually religion is both a supporter and a barrier to managing these cases. When people are being blamed for what is happening to them, on the guise of religion, then it's going to be a huge barrier. Whereas sometimes the community that is produced from these religious organizations helps people cope with the circumstances that they're facing in general. Some helpful interventions that are going to help is integrating cultural sensitivity. We need to understand that what works in the Western world is not going to work in the communal society of the African continent. So we need to kind of like combine the two and create a different way of approaching mental health in the continent. And we need community-based approaches as well, because it's a very communal society, as I mentioned earlier. And we need policy-level interventions that protect women, girls, and kids in general. Some of the most important things we need to do is we need to have awareness campaigns about these displaced people, about gender-based violence, and so on. And we need gender-specific interventions in general, such as strong laws that should be enforced against domestic violence and sexual assault. Most of the African continent, women who are married are not, if they are raped by their spouses, it is not considered as rape. So it's that kind of things that we need to address. The recommendations I have, and I'm sure there's going to be more that needs to be done. We need enhanced mental health funding and policies. We need resources to reduce stigma through education and advocacy for mental health. And we need to expand access specifically into the rural areas. Thank you for your attention. Amasaganalo is what thank you means in my own language.
Thank you, Betty. Okay, we're going to have a panel discussion, and I understand some of you need to get to class. So if you need to get to class, we don't want you to be late. Feel free to go to class. And these are being taped. So if you want to watch the panel discussion, you'll be able to watch it on our website. That's at traumacentral.org. It'll be all uploaded there. Thanks, everybody, for coming. So, Megan, are you going to have time to do panel discussion? You are. Okay. So, and then can we bring up our Zoom team? Some chairs. Hey, Patrick. Hey, Gloria.
Hey, actually.
Patrick and Gloria are from Zambia. They're both former KU fellows. So Patrick was one of our international orthopedic trauma fellows. He is at a hospital in Zambia. It's a children's hospital. St. John Paul's, I don't want to say it wrong. It's, can you say the name for me? I don't.
It's St. John Paul II Orthopedic Mission Hospital.
That's right. That's right. St. John Paul II Orthopedic Mission Hospital. And Gloria was a fellow with our family practice department working with Sarah Kessler. I don't think Sarah's on today, but Gloria, Patrick, welcome. Thanks for being with us. Also on our panel is Betty, who just spoke with us, and Dr. Beza, who is our current International Orthopedic Trauma Fellow. So I want to turn it over to Megan, who's going to be moderating the discussion for us. And for the panelists, we'll just come sit over here, those that are in person.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Joey and I are both going to run the panel. And so to start things off, I have a question for you, Gloria. Could you tell us a little bit about what the acute effects of sexual assault and gender-related violence?
Hello, I'll say good afternoon or good evening here. Please, can you come up with your question, please?
Yes. What are the acute effects of sexual assault and gender-related violence?
Yes, I would say that the acute effects of sexual violence are many, but most of them we can talk about the psychological effect. Are you getting me, please?
We are getting you. I just want to see if I can turn this up. But no, go ahead, Gloria.
Yeah. I said on the acute effect, we can have the psychological effect and some medical effect, which are different from each patient or from each victim. But on them, I can name the psychological and then the medical one. On the psychological one, we are finding people are very anxious. People are very anxious and they have difficulty regulation on the emotions, and then some dissociation, and they are withdrawing from the community. Also, on the medical part, what we are seeing, we are noticing that people are in pain. They are at risk of unwanted pregnancies. Also, the risk of the trauma fistula, which is happening during that time. I think those are the main one on the acute phase.
Thank you for sharing that, Gloria. And if anyone in the audience has any specific questions, feel free to jump in. A follow-up question to that would be, what are some of the chronic effects of sexual assaults?
The chronic one we are seeing many is on the long term, on the mental health, where we have the post-traumatic disorder, stress disorders. Also, the depression, the social and relation difficult, where we are seeing people have difficulties to forming relationships, they're tending to withdraw themselves. Also, the most common is the traumatic fistula, which we are seeing most in the DRC, where people, especially women and girls, are being assaulted by many troops, armed groups. So it leads them to the chronic incontinence. So that chronic incontinence make them to not live in properly into the community. And then the readaptation is very hard for them. So those fistula can take too long time, most of 3 to 4 months for them to heal, while some can't even manage to get any medical attention, which is very difficult for them. Those are most of the chronic effects we can have in those cases.
Gloria, could you, for those who don't know, explain what a fistula is, what you're talking about there, and what is it that causes the fistulas?
Yes, the cause of the fistula, what we are noticing in the east part of the Congo, is that traumatic violence assault happening on the women. We can see many men on one woman, or they are using sometimes, I would say they can use guns, thrusting into the intimate part of the woman, which is causing the physical trauma. We are going to see that we are going to see that they are forming a wall between the vagina, the urethra, and the rectum, which is producing the leaking between those three apparel. So, which is making that leaking or there will be a leakage between those three apparel, the urethra, the vagina, and the rectum. You see the women will not be possible to contain herself to maybe to go to pee or to have feces. Both of them will be just leaking at the same time, I think, which is very difficult for surviving.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Gloria. The next question that we have is for you, Dr. Beza. What are the effects of conflict in terms of providing healthcare?
Someone speak from my experience. So when you are in this conflict related, the material conflict related injuries and trauma, means we're talking about wars and this kind of important from wars. So what we do to us is it's going to overburden healthcare facilities. And that will drain resources, exhaust everything that you have. Not only that, to produce efficient burnout, and some of them, which especially those who are working in those areas, working area, some of them might lose their lives, some of them leave from that areas. And it's just making it difficult to do the hardest care needed for the society as well. General population. What happened in my country with that wartime means every hospital was especially with trauma care were shut down to the society, and it was just allocated for those war victims. And you can see if those who are in control with armed groups, being the military or the rebels, what they will do to you is they will shift every resource that groups level that product is for the injured armed forces they have. So that was what happened to my case. And so they're training every resource. Sometimes there were times that we were exhausting every instrument and plans that we have. So we just do some surgeries and not able to do appropriate equipment to put in there. So costs kind of make a wiggle for the room to get, which is the idea of the
Thank you for sharing that, Dr. Beza, and supporting with your own personal background. Our next question is for the panel as a whole. O just asked in the Zoom chat if we can explain in a little bit more detail how developing sustainable healthcare can help address some of the or mitigate some of the conflict in the areas, especially regarding the precious metals. So how can addressing trauma lead to stabilizing, mitigating conflict in these areas where they're reliant on exporting these precious metals?
So we are a transportation. So what we can do is we have to advocate on strengthening these healthcare providing centers to allocate budgets, policies on strengthening those healthcare systems. Training physicians to manage such traumas and services and to be prepared for this emergency crisis. And also help them build facility to do such a thing. And we can also give them emotional, psychosocial support because some of the physical trauma that's such a kind of society will do. So you have to also focus on that psychosocial support.
Patrick, do you have anything to say on that? I'm curious on your end. Since you're so close to a lot of what's occurring in the Congo, can you see how developing a health system that can handle the trauma could have a positive impact in the area? And maybe even in terms of like helping promote peace or stabilize the economy. Just curious as to your thoughts on that.
Okay, what I can say is this. Because when you see what is happening right now, like what's happening in the eastern part of Congo with the war which is existing right now, means the health system is completely is not functioning at all. Means people are injured because if you're not killed, some are injured and everything because they have to run, they have to find a safe place to be. And it's quite difficult now to access health centers because even the health centers, they are affected. And what happened when the rebels get into the town, what they are going to start with is just to cut electricity in that region. But imagine without electricity, even if you have to save people, perform some surgery and everything, but you don't have electricity, how are we going to have sterile material, sterile instrument? Is completely impossible, even if you now with that instability which is there, is quite difficult to have well-established health centers. It's difficult to have people who are qualified to do the job. And the example, like right now, I had two patients who came especially for the same area. One had a fracture of the tibia. There's a doctor who came from somewhere just to put an external fixator on the patient and left. And okay, what's the future of that patient? No one knew how to manage now that patient. And I was talking with that patient on WhatsApp, how to continue the treatment, and that patient had to travel from there. And no, that one wanted to travel and come to Zambia to continue the treatment, but they had the connection with someone who was in Kenya, was closer to the place she was staying, and she managed to go to Kenya to continue the treatment. I have another one who came from the refugee camp and came to the hospital because it was difficult to be treated from there, and he came up to our hospital because he has one of the sisters who live in the US was able to pay for the trip and for him to have an operation to my hospital, and now he left and he went back to where he stays. I think that's how difficult it is now. If we have a society, a place where first there is peace and everything, is very easy to build a sustainable health system, and where we are able to develop in terms of infrastructure, to develop also in terms of training people who can perform those surgery. Because right now, definitely, I've just given you two examples, but every day I receive X-ray in my WhatsApp coming from neighboring place and everything where people are looking for help. Not that they don't have money to access those treatment, but they are not aware that this can be done, this one can be repaired, and we have to explain that yes, we can do this, we can do that, and that's all that situation can affect the health system, and if we add peace in that region, we are able to develop the health system there, and people, they don't need to travel all the way from there to come and get treatment and go back. That's what I can say about what's the situation.
Healthcare in general. during the height of the Ethiopian wars, most women who were seeking help and for violence and like victims of survivors of trauma and abuse, they used to say this thing where they say, "This is the first time I felt safe and alive." So we kind of downgrade or downplay what a hospital or a clinic plays in that care. It's not only that they give care and provision to heal the patient's body, it's also a place where most people feel safe because the area is very unsafe. And another thing is most of those institutions have multi-ethnic care providers. And it kind of creates a place and a space where certain ethnic person who's from different ethnic background than you is seen as the enemy, as the monster that's like far away. But when they're the people who are giving you care, providing care and supporting you, it's a place where you can see them as a person. So in that regard, I think like it would create some not very significant, but some form of reconciliation as well.
It is the halo effect of healthcare. I spent some time in the military, in the infantry. And the one thing I saw in the conflicts I was involved in was our best outreach to the people around us was our medical providers. And it was exactly what you said, Betty. It was the people we were amongst who we did not share the same culture with, not even necessarily the same religion, saw that we brought resources to help treat their medical needs. And somehow that bridged the gap. And I didn't know if you felt that that would be the same in Africa, but to me, it seems like one effect that developing good healthcare systems would have is if you have people with multiple ethnicities and religions working together to provide care to everyone, I think that at least demonstrates to the society that this can work, that you can live together peaceably. It seems like there's this halo effect.
Yeah, and during our medical practice, like medical school years, I remember where like we have this system where you just placed into different medical schools. You don't have a say or a choice where you go basically. And what they do is they take somebody from this region and place them in another. So they learn the culture, they learn the people, they understand how the community works. And most of them actually end up staying in those regions and going to there. So it kind of gives an idea to you of all who are around you are just like you. That's how it's
Patrick, is most of the violence around like conflict minerals, is that ethnically driven? Or is it mostly purely opportunistic and economic? Is it poverty that drives it? What is it?
No, actually, there are two types of conflict, as you explained on your, I think that was your second slide. The conflict in regard of the precious stones is more politics. There's no ethnicity there, it's more politics because like what happened right now on the eastern part of the DR Congo means that there are some also neighboring countries involved and saying that they are fighting rebels from their own country to not come back to disturb the power in place. And some also of the rebels who are fighting the power in DR Congo because they say, okay, there is a lack of democracy, there's this. They're giving all sorts of reasons, but the main conflict there is the precious stones. Because if that region was poor, you will never hear about any conflict in that region. Yeah, and that's what's happening there. But there's another type of conflict, like what I experienced myself the time I was more younger. That was more because of the tribe, ethnicity conflict. Because what happened is from the place where we are living is like people from ethnic were actually in number than the people who are originally from the place we are living on. Means that make that like people from my tribe were like occupying a more strategic post in companies or even in the school where I was, which was a class A school, and we're actually in numbers than people from the originally from that place, and that created that conflict, and it was actually also triggered by politicians. But we had that conflict not because of mineral of precious stone, but it was not just because of you are not from this province, but you are occupying strategic position in society than people belong to the place, and that created that conflict. Okay, that's one my experience the time I was young. Means those are the type of conflicts we have. But what is happening in the Eastern Province? There's no ethnicity. That is pure the mineral which they are looking for. That's what's happening there.
So interesting. Thank you for sharing, Dr. Patrick. And we have a follow-up question for you. Could you talk a little bit about what the conflicts are like in Africa?
Okay, as I was saying, actually, the conflict are more generated by politicians, either concerning the mineral, concerning whatever, but is more politicians because they want to have power to control and to have control of certain region and everything. Now they have to manipulate people. And they are going to say, you see, these people, they are not from this province, but you see, they are dominating here and everything. Then we have to do something. And they just put those things in people's minds. And then you will see jealousy start raising up and everything. So you were friend with someone, and suddenly, because you belong to different ethnies, and you become enemies, and it starts like that, and it becomes general. It perpetuates like that. And that's what's happening. And compare to what's happening in the Eastern Province, which has been there for more than 30 years, that is because even people who are engaged in the fight, sometimes they communicate. Means people that actually they enjoy that conflict to not have a hand, because when it stopped, things are regulated and everything. Means if this mineral has to go to the UK or to Europe, you have to follow the rules of the country for it to get out. You have to pay taxes and everything. That become difficult. But right now it's like they're getting it for free. And now they actually triggered that conflict and everything to create some rebel which they are claiming for something which doesn't exist, and conflict start like that. That's where we have this conflict start in different places, just to have power. They are looking to have that power.
So it's more profitable to harvest minerals in a conflict than it is to harvest minerals without conflict? Did I hear you say that correctly?
Yes, it's more profitable because it's not controlled. You can you can get the way you want because there's no control there, and there's no regulation, there's no tax to pay, there's nothing. It's more profitable. That's why people who are involved in even those, generally, even those government are involved in the country, in the conflict. Some they enjoy that conflict to continue because it's more profitable like that to them.
And I guess, to follow that up, I mean, everything's cheaper. If you're harvesting minerals in a conflict, you can use the enemy you capture to be your labor. You don't have to pay them. I don't know. I've heard and I've read about, is that what's occurring there? Or I'm sure these aren't, safe working conditions.
No, because you see this rebel group, where are they getting weapons from, and how are they sustaining themselves? Is because they are getting finance from all these rich countries who want those minerals. That's why they will make sure that those rebel group continue to exist in those regions, because they are giving them weapon, they are giving them money, and that peace will never be there. And then in exchange, they can get mineral from those regions. And that's the way these conflicts have been there for years. And this is like, it's almost impossible to have solution in that. And to the effect of that, that is the poor population who is suffering, because they can't access to school, they can't access to healthcare, they can't get a proper job and everything is disturbed in those regions.
Patrick, is it possible that from the same rich nations that are passing laws to prohibit the use of conflict minerals, also from those nations, somehow arms are getting from them into the hands of rebels? Do you understand my question? I don't know if, I mean, if you don't feel comfortable answering that, don't, but that didn't occur to me until I heard you just speaking, but I mean, it sounds like you said richer nations want these minerals, and that is very apparent. I mean, a large part of our economy can't exist without those minerals. But is it possible that from these richer nations that are passing laws, you know, to make it harder to get conflict minerals, at the same time, arms are coming from those nations to outfit those rebels? Am I
Okay,
understanding correctly?
I hope I got you properly. Actually, what need to be done first is these neighboring countries who are involved in these all conflict and everything to collaborate. Because if everyone is, okay, why it become difficult is because for someone to get in power, you need to give guarantees to people who are supporting him. For you to become president, you give us guarantees that we'll have this, we'll have this. And when you become president, in exchange, you have to now to fulfill what you promised. And when you don't do that, they will make sure you get out of your seat. Definitely, that's the things. And now is to have genuine people who have to fight for their own country, for the population, to develop that area and everything is generally difficult, because in the same, because people who are fighting there are not people who are benefiting for all these mineral and everything. No, people are fighting. They belong to the same country, but they're in fight because these others, they are given something that you have to continue to perpetuate this, and you are getting advantage, you are getting profit, and in exchange, the mineral, it's just very difficult, I think, to have a solution to this. That's why it has been there for years, and everything is difficult to get a solution to this problem. I don't know how we can get out of that.
Well, I love how you ended that, because that was the point of the whole lecture. Is that, you know, I think some people could look at conflict in Africa, and we can have Betty and Dr. Beza weigh in on this as well. But you just said it, and I said it earlier. This is a very complex problem, and there are many things involved here that are driving and perpetuating conflict in Africa. And to think that the way to solve this trauma epidemic is to simply stop the conflict is very short-sighted. Because although that needs to happen, and we need to work towards building peace, which involves many things, that's not going to happen overnight. But we can build hospitals, we can make health systems that can be constructed very quickly and much quicker than we're going to create peace. And so I just think, that's the whole point of this lecture. What are your thoughts on that? Dr. Beza?
Yeah, I was trying to say before, I think this organization, our organization is, what we can do is, thanksgiving perhaps care facility, the sustaining equipment that they can use, and training, because that is human care. Otherwise, you cannot go and, I mean, we at the same time, we cannot advocate peace and prosperity, but I think as a health professional, what we can do is just giving service, and that's also selfless, because in these conflict areas, it can be hard, because I have seen there are reports, even if it's not coming out in my country, there are reports that physicians are being killed because they just giving service. When we force it to please for those only, I have been forced. I have been forced to treat only the alcohol. I'm not going to mention which is who is who, but I have been forced to treat only alcohol during the war. I know that I've done like 25 days in 5 days. You know, like that. Make me build a team, and we just schedule everyone that we have. And trying to treat everyone.
75 cases in 5 days.
Yes. And those are not civilian. Those are military. So me and my team that we made Navis who were laid down. And it was not for the part but then
And Betty, by the way, Betty's a pediatrician, who, worked in Addis, a Black Lion. And, what are your thoughts on?
Yeah, I think what we can do is what we could control, because the situation has so many layers and it's very complex. What we can do is what we can control. And as Dr. Beza was mentioning, there are situations and times where we've all, as physicians, been in sticky situations. My ICU, half of it was closed off because I cannot use it anymore because military people have to be treated there, and pediatric ICU is the first one we have because pediatrics has it's a very like new and emerging field in the country, so it's not given as much as the others, and that's like where the times I advocate for my team, my patients, and I had to get that overturned, even though like it was completely overturned. Some of the base and some of the rooms were taken, but I did bring that to concern most of my ICU. So what we can do is again train qualified individuals to care for the patients, and to have multi-layered teams where not only physical illness but mental illness can be addressed, and we can create a space where we can manage the cases that we have. But when it comes to advocacy, we can advocate for our patients and for what we see in our surrounding, but changing policies regarding conflict is a very hard thing to do as care providers and physicians, I would say.
Yeah, one thing, I think of when I'm solving any problem, and I'll tell my team this is I'll say, we can only solve what happens from here down. Meaning, chain of command, above us, be it the government or our own institution, we can make recommendations, but we don't have the power to necessarily change these other things. We can speak about it, but that's about as far as we can go. But what we can affect is what occurs from here down. Those things are, like, we have the ability to help create a healthcare system. We have the ability to help make their hospitals better. And those are the things we can do, and they can have a positive impact on spreading peace by, I feel like, having different ethnicities work together and bring care to all people, as well as diversifying the economy. Because by building hospitals and by making hospitals more efficient, you're employing the surgeons, the nurses, all the ancillary staff, the radiology technicians, the people who, from the janitorial staff, which are incredibly important, all the way to the people who take care of the grounds of the hospital. It's having a halo effect, and then all the businesses around that help support the hospital in terms of doing the laundry. And even if it involves making, or producing meals for patients and doing the lab work, if that's not in the hospital. So you diversify an economy just by making a health system, and you provide essential needs as well. Now, I'm curious, as you alluded to, Betty is a pediatric intensivist. So is the healthcare system in Ethiopia now capable of handling all the pediatric, like, intensive care that needs to be done?
The short answer is absolutely not. And the long answer is absolutely not, but with all the reasons, right? So it's a very emerging field. When I was starting off, there were only 3 intensivists in the pediatric field. We did train a lot of fellows afterwards, and currently we have 4. But mind you, it is a nation with 120 million people, and regarding access to it, usually we've tried to train not only fellows but existing pediatricians to be able to care for patients in critical care, and we did try to establish some form of, we might not call it an ICU per se, but we did try to create high dependence units in different regions in the country. And that does help to some degree, but we are extremely far behind. In a country where majority of the population thinks when you have a child die at early age, it's okay, you can have another one. It's kind of, pediatrics takes a buffer. And even from that, infectious diseases takes most of the, like, big attention when it comes to pediatrics. Things like trauma or patients who require surgical interventions, congenital anomalies are completely forgotten. Some of them don't even have a place in the Ministry of Health where they could be placed, where they could get funding. So it's really hard to get that, and it's very young.
And I think the point with this lecture is, if your healthcare system currently, doesn't have enough to handle the needs that it's having without a major conflict occurring, there's no way it can, because it needs, once a conflict occurs. Although, and we're not going to speak much about that, but there's currently conflict in Ethiopia. So I don't think we need to necessarily get very granular about that. Meg and Joy, did you guys have any other questions?
No, that's all the questions we had.
Patrick and Gloria, did you have any final statements or things that you want to say?
Yeah, thank you for this talk, because it's a most sensitive one, because for people to talk about this, most of people are scared of their life, but someone need to talk at least about this. And then maybe would say, once the voices are going up for now, maybe in 2 years, maybe 5 years later, it will bring up some solution, which is hard to find, because I think those minds are kind of terrorizing people. you are just leaving your own place where you used to live, and then you become refugees somewhere where it not belong to you. And then you are not making the life the way it's supposed to be. But if people can come together, we try to do maybe a win-win process, and then we think about to put all those wealth together to see how to build some hospitals, how to train some medical doctors, so people who avoid to go maybe abroad. Like here in Africa, when you are seeing the all part of the South Africa, many medical doctors are coming from the DRC. They're good doctors, but once you go into DRC, we are not finding the qualified doctor to take care of people, which is very sad with that situation. I think we can appeal to those multinationals to think about that. You are getting the mining, at least you help also that country to build up something for its people. I think that is my request.
Okay, what I can say is this. I think Gloria said it all. You remember, actually, I told you that I do go to do some surgeries in the DR Congo. And the place where I usually go, that's where there's war right now. And that make things difficult to go, because what we are planning right now, myself together with one of the spine surgeon and some is to go, and we are making a list of equipment which is needed there, because what we are doing before, we are traveling with equipment. We go there, we do surgeries, and we come back again with the equipment. Now we're planning just to have equipment in the hospital we are working with, and then it's going to be easy whenever we go there and to perform those surgeries. But which is right now difficult, because we can't go, because it's difficult first, even when you are a surgeon or health worker, to go and work in the such environment where yourself you are unsecure. That become actually very difficult. That means whatever plan we had for that region is on hold. And but that doesn't stop people to get injured, people to get sick, because the numbers is still going up, but they can't get good treatment. They can't be attended to because they don't have adequate equipment that side. And that's a reality. What's happening in that region, I mean, it's difficult to build up a sustainable health system in the conflict region. And that makes things difficult, though people who come from there, like come to Zambia to have surgery, they find the fellow Congolese is here, is the one operating on them, while it was supposed to be easy to do things for them and to be more cheap, and that makes things difficult. I think that's what I can add on this one.
That's really good. Patrick, I think you do great work. Your hospital does great work. I mean, I think the fact that you go to the Congo and do that work, I think it's just so impressive to me. I think we need to do a lot more brainstorming. I mean, our university, your hospital, and just come up with what would be the best solution for the current situation there. And I wish you the best of luck.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any here, Dr. Basil? Any closing comments?
Yeah, it's so what we can based on what
Thanks, everybody.
And let's give our panel a big round of applause. Thanks for joining us today, everybody.